All right, this is the fifth multiple choice section review. We're going to start on, in the last video we left off on Unit 4, Question 7. So here we are in Unit 4, Question 8. And they're about to start asking me questions about, monetary policy. Great to take care of that beforehand. So I want to go over here and I just want to review the mechanics of monetary policy because it's going to answer a ton of these questions for us. Remember, first, a couple of things. Monetary policy is just like fiscal policy. The goal is to move aggregate demand. And they tend to be short-run goals to fix short-run problems of either inflation or unemployment. All right? Monetary policy, though, has a couple of nicknames. It's expansionary monetary policy. Sometimes they call that easy money or easy monetary policy. Okay? And then if it's contractionary, which I'll draw down here, sometimes they call that tight money or tight monetary policy. So you can't let that bother you. And there are three things that I draw when I want to illustrate monetary policy. All right? Two graphs, and then a connection in between. If you can't draw and label and use the two graphs, it's going to be, you're probably not going to pass the AP test because it's a huge portion of the AP test. For example, this graph right here, GDP, price level, aggregate supply, full employment GDP. This is the most important graph in the whole class. You've got to be able to draw it. And I'm about to draw expansionary monetary policy, so I'm going to make sure my aggregate demand is down here in a recession. Okay? So, what is expansionary or easy monetary policy? It's when the Fed uses one of its three tools, which were reviewed at the end of the last video, buying and selling government securities, changing the discount rate, or changing the required reserve ratio, to change the supply of money. So you need to be able to label the market for money. Quantity of money. The price of money is the nominal interest rate, because we're drawing the market for money. Over on the market for loanable funds, we use the real interest rate. So how do you keep straight which is which? Well, this is the market for money, and M for money and N for nominal are next to each other in the alphabet. That's how I keep it straight. Here's the supply of money, which is vertical and set by the Fed. Here's the demand for money, which you should never move unless they tell you to. All right? It's very, very, very rare for you to need to move the demand for money for any reason. So just leave it alone. The Fed moves the supply of money, and when they want to expand, they want to increase aggregate demand. All right, it's sort of intuitive. They're going to feed some more money into the system. All right? Typically they do that. The most common way is by buying government bonds. Think about it. If I'm the Fed and I buy government bonds, the bonds come to me, but the money goes into somebody's hands. If I buy them from a bank, they're excess reserves to that bank to loan and get reloaned and reloaned and reloaned and multiplied. If I buy them from a human, that human puts it in the money in the bank. All right? So either way, expansionary monetary policy is expanding the money supply, which causes the interest rate to fall. And I have a tattoo with what happens when the interest rate falls. Investment goes up. And we know that more investment increases aggregate demand, because aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X of N. Don't ever move aggregate demand without giving your justification of why. Is it C, I, G, or X? In this case, it's I. Move to the right, aggregate demand prime. And that would, yes, it would cause price level to go up, and that's not good. I sometimes draw a sad face there. Don't draw sad or happy faces in the AP test. All right? Yes, and more inflation is a problem, but the purpose was we're in a recession to fix the recession. That would be good. It would be more GDP and lower unemployment. Okay? So that's expansionary monetary policy. By the way, that's the short-run effect. You can also have long-run effects like this more investment. What are they buying here? Sandwiches? Well, they're buying capital, and that's a resource. And if you buy enough capital, you can get growth in the long run. More capital here can lead to growth. So that's expansionary. Contractionary is, I'll draw it really quickly, the opposite. It's where the supply of money moves to the left. Should you touch here? It's the set amount. That raises the interest rate, increases investment, and they would do that. Oh no, sorry, not quantity of money. GDP. The Fed would do this if there was inflation, right? If aggregate demand was too far to the right and there was inflation, then they wanted to move it to the left with the less investment. So I'm kind of rushing, so that's C plus I plus G plus X of N. Okay, so that would, yes, it would cause less GDP, but it would help with the inflation. Now, notice something. There's a kind of a kind of check at the end you can do. Look at the expansionary side. Everything increases. Everything. Supply of money, investment, aggregate demand, the price level, and GDP. The only thing that falls is the interest rate. The only thing that goes the other way is the interest rate. With tight money policy, everything decreases, except the interest rate goes up. I guess you might could say here, well, tight money policy is less GDP, so that's more unemployment. You can say unemployment goes up. But there is that nice check at the end. And let's see if that will help us answer a bunch of these questions. We're going to go fast, because that's what we're doing. All right, which of the following does the Federal Reserve use most often to combat a recession? All right, so they're going to want, that's expansionary policy. What is their most commonly used tool? Buying and selling government securities. They might call them government bonds on the AP test. They might call them treasury bonds in the Treasury Department. They might call them treasury notes. Doesn't matter. They're buying government securities, so B. Okay, number 9. That's the one they use most often for expansion. To reduce inflation, that's contraction. Notice, I try to think of, is this going to be expansion or contraction right at the beginning, because it kind of answers the question for me. To reduce inflation, the Federal Reserve could, so I want contraction. Well, that would be contract the money supply. That raises interest rates. How do I know? I just drew it, and I would redraw it if I forgot. All right, here, redraw it if I forgot. Move the supply of money to the left and see what happens. If I forget what happens to interest rates, I just move it to the left and see. It raises interest rates, which decreases investment. That's true. My tattoo said so. That's D. 10. Okay. Reserves, the money supply and interest rates are likely to change in which of the following way when the Fed sells bonds? Selling, let me think what that would be. I don't want to memorize. Let me think what that would be. If I was the Fed and I was selling bonds, the bonds would go away from me and money would come to me out of the system. That's contractionary. And all these tools of money policy work through bank reserves. You can think about them working through bank reserves. Let's think expansion. Well, this question is about contraction, but let's think expansion. If the Fed buys bonds, they eventually make it to banks and become excess reserves that can be loaned. If the Fed lowers the lowers the required reserve rate, they're telling banks, you can loan more. You can have more excess reserves to loan. If the Fed lowers the discount rate, a bank can get a loan from the Fed for cheaper, and that's all excess reserves. They all work through excess reserves. So, in this case, I think it's contractionary money policy. Is this the one we're on? Yeah, sell bonds, that's contraction. So that would reduce reserves, reducing the money supply. And the only thing that goes up with contraction is the interest rate. So it's D. All right, number 11, which of the following actions by the Federal Reserve will result in an increase in banks' excess reserves? So what's going to cause banks to have more money in their bank that they're allowed to loan? Buying bonds in the open market. I like that. Because they buy them from a bank, that bank has excess reserves. If they buy them from a human, and that human buys a bunch of hats, the hat store owner puts it in his bank. Either way, the money makes it to banks as reserves. Okay. All right. Let's go to 12. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis suggests that in the short run, an expansionary policy will result in. Okay. What's expansionary policy? It's aggregate demand to the right. Not aggregate demand to the left. Short run, the aggregate supply curve doesn't really move. All right, or I wouldn't move it. If they're talking about policy, all of our policies, fiscal or monetary, are aggregate demand movers. So this is a question about policy. It's not supply curve. An increase in real. Okay, wait. Expansionary. Okay, I like this. An increase in real GDP without much inflation when the economy is in the horizontal portion of the aggregate supply curve. They just lost me. I just got a little confused. But that's okay. I'm going to draw a quick picture just to clarify. I do know that we typically zoom in on the diagonal part of aggregate supply, but it really has kind of 3 sections. The horizontal, the intermediate, and the vertical. The Keynesian, the intermediate, and the classical. So if we're over in the horizontal, let me stretch out the horizontal a little bit to kind of, so we can move around. If we're in the horizontal, and we get expansionary policy and move aggregate demand to the right, looks like that won't lead to much change in the price level. but it will increase GDP. I like that answer. I don't like these other ones. I like C. Alright, when in doubt, draw a little picture. Draw a little picture when you're not in doubt. Just to check. Which of the following combinations of monetary policy actions would definitely cause an increase in aggregate demand? Alright, so I'm looking for expansionary policies. The way I think about it is I think about, well, buy or sell government bonds. If I'm the Fed and I buy the bonds, the money goes into the system. That's expansionary. And then the other two things, I want to make it easier on banks. I want to loosen the screws. If it's expansionary, I want to loosen the screws. I want to make things easier. If it's contractionary, I want to tighten the screws and make things harder on banks. Okay? So let's see. I want decrease in aggregate demand, so I want contraction. I want to tighten the screws. So raise that discount rate, make it harder for banks to get a loan from the Fed. Sell bonds as contractionary. And then raise that required reserve. Make banks hold more. Don't let them loan as much. Loans create money. So don't let them loan as much. That'll be contractionary. I like E. That's the answer. Okay. And which of the following is most likely to increase the velocity of money? Now, the determinants of the velocity of money are debatable anyway. The AP test does not ask about them. But this does remind us to quickly study the monetary equation of exchange. So I'm going to turn my camera back over here. All that stuff over there, that's Keynesian monetary policy. Remember we learned there's 3 schools of monetary policy? There's the normal mainstream view is Keynesianism. It's the one that's used most often. It's what our Fed does. It's what our Congress typically does. It's Keynesian. But then there's kind of some side views that all go under the heading of neoclassical or new classical, or you could just say classical economics. So let's come back over here. Yeah. Keynesian, all the policy tools and approaches that we learned, all those graphs over there are Keynesian. All right, but then separate from them you have the neoclassicals, and they're just new versions of classical economics. Classical economics says the government shouldn't mess with the economy, so they don't like fiscal policy. They don't like the Fed engaging in monetary policy. One school of the classical thought is the monetarists, or you could say monetarism. This is a little confusing because some people get tricked into thinking, oh, they must love monetary policy. They must love what the Fed does. No, they do not like the Fed's monetary policy. Monetarists think we don't need a Fed. More on them in a second. And then rational expectations theory, I think, is reviewed in a question that we're not going to get to today, but it's all based on how people's rational expectations will offset all policy anyway. But I do want to talk about those monetarists. Those monetarists don't believe what Keynesians believe about the effect of monetary policy. Keynesians believe that stuff. This idea that changing the money supply works its way through interest rates and investments and affects aggregate demand that way. My tattoo is a Keynesian tattoo. Change the money supply works its way through interest rates and investments and affects aggregate demand that way. Monetarists say, no it doesn't. They say changing the money supply directly affects price level and GDP. You don't have to go through interest rates and investment like those lame-o Keynesians think you do. All right? Here's how they think things work. Here's how they model the economy. They don't have to draw the supply and demand for money and have a tattoo and all that. They draw the monetary equation of exchange, MV equals PQ. Let me remind you about the parts. V is the velocity of money, but it's assumed to be constant most of the time. If it changes, the question ends up being pretty easy no matter what anyway. We don't ask you much about that. Other than to say, what is the velocity of money? It's the amount of times per year an average dollar is spent. So how fast money gets spent. M is how much money is there. Total money. Supply of money. It's M1, supply of money. Alright. And then I'll leave V underlying because it's constant. P is the price level. Q is real GDP. We want this one to go up, real GDP. We don't want the price level to go up. That's inflation. By the way, what do you call real GDP if you take price level and multiply it in there? That's nominal GDP. Yeah? Which one is on the axes of aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Which one is that? That's real. That wouldn't be nominal. You wouldn't have price level mixed in here.
This price level's over there. Okay, so that's real GDP just like that is, and that's price level just like that is. Okay, and so monitors say this. They say real GDP can potentially grow at some pretty steady rate every year. But it can't grow much faster than that, and we don't want it to grow slower. All right, so real GDP can grow at usually what they say 3 to 5% a year. Well, whatever it is, that's how fast it can grow. Okay, well and we control, the Fed controls, monetary policy controls M. Well, if V is pretty constant, pretty steady, if you keep M the same, if this side of the equation stays the same, can this side possibly grow? No way. That's what an equation says, is if this side's the same, this side's the same. So it's not a good idea to keep the money supply the same. You do want to grow it enough to support real GDP growth. You do want to feed enough extra money to the economy every year so real GDP can grow according to its potential. But eventually real GDP hits a ceiling. And if you grow the money supply by even more, what's the only pressure valve that can give over here? We're at the maximum growth we can get to, and you just keep feeding money to the economy. You feed 7% extra money or 10% extra money. What will happen? Price level is the only thing that can go up to match, and that's inflation and that's bad. So here's what their conclusion is. Based on all that, their conclusion is pretty simple. How fast can GDP grow? And you say, well, 3 to 5%. They say, increase the money supply by that amount every year, no more, no less. So do they want the Fed messing with the money supply? No. They want a robot that figures out how fast growth can occur and then feeds that much money into the economy. All right? Monetarists do not like the monetary policy of the Fed. Our Fed tends to be Keynesian. Okay? There you go. I don't care what the answer to this question is. They're not going to ask that on the AP test. I mean, velocity of money, determinants of the velocity of money are debatable. Anyway. Okay. 15. Which of the following characteristics of money could be found in borrow? Oh yeah, and I asked you to skip 15 because it's about some characteristics of money that we don't care about. The ones you care about are medium. If it is money, it has to function as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. This question has to do with portability and uniformity and fungibility, and that's just beyond this course. 16. The real interest rate is simply stated as, real and nominal. Cool, I know how to do that. Nominal over real equals price index over 100, except for when you're dealing with interest rates. If you're dealing with real and nominal GDP, real and nominal wages, nominal over real equals price index over 100 is the ticket. It'll do it. It'll take care of everything, except for interest rates. This is a separate one you got to memorize. But the nominal interest rate is equal to, this is how much banks will actually charge you. Say that they charge you 8%. Well, they're not going to benefit 8%. They do have some amount they want to benefit. They had some amount they want to make so they can be a business. That's called the real interest rate. All right? But they also charge you for inflation because they're hurt by inflation. So they charge you what's called an inflation premium, or we could say expected inflation or anticipated inflation. So if they really wanted to make 5%, but they expected inflation to be 3%, they would charge you 8%. All right? So, what's the nominal interest rate? That. If they ever ask you to define the nominal interest rate, don't write a paragraph, write that. Right? It's real interest rate plus expected inflation. And you'll be done, and you'll have the right answer. What if they ask you what the real interest rate is? Do some good old, yeah, you're right. Do some good old Algebra 1 and get expected inflation to cancel and get a real interest rate by itself. It's nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. So I think that's what they asked me to do here on this question. And so the answer is D. Way to go. Vault cash and reserve accounts. The AP test won't call them reserve accounts. They'll call them deposits with the Fed. This is a reference. I'm not even sure if I care what the answer to this question is, but it does remind me of something. This is a reference to the idea that banks have to keep reserves. We know that. The Fed set some reserve requirement. They would probably like to loan out just everything so they can make huge profits. But they have to keep some on reserve for safety. The Fed sets that amount. What do they keep it? They can either keep it in their vault as vault cash, or they can keep it in the Fed's vaults on deposit with the Fed. Either one is fine. Okay? All right? Those are both count as reserves. Either of those count in the money supply? Cash counts as in the money supply, but what if it's in a bank's vaults or in the Fed's vault? No. Once it's at a bank, it doesn't count. So I don't necessarily like this question very much. I think they're getting at both vault cash and cash in the Fed's vaults on deposit with the Fed is maintained by the bank at a fixed percentage set by the Federal Reserve. And then I also like choice E, so I can say these are not part of the money supply. What? Sometimes. My checking account earns a little bit of interest. Oh, yeah. Do they earn interest? That's why I don't like this question very much. I don't know. I don't think the Fed pays them interest on deposits. But I know the answer is C. But I guess some of them must earn interest. I don't know. I guess they do, because when a bank keeps its deposits at the Fed, sometimes they loan it to other banks overnight and charge them the federal funds rate. So I wouldn't worry too terribly much about that idea. I would worry about what I emphasized. The neutrality of money, I told you to skip this one. I want to ask you about that. Expansionary monetary policy results in which of the following in the short run? Well, we just drew that. If you want to redraw it, redraw it. All right? It does increase the money supply, so one has to be in our answer. It's not that one or that one. The nominal interest rate decreases. Oh, man, I forgot. Let me draw a picture to tell me the answer. Expansionary money supply, or monetary policy, moves supply of money to the right, interest rate falls. So I like that. I like 2. I like 1. I like 2. My answer has to have both 1 and 2 in it. Well, all 3 of those do. That didn't help. The real interest rate decreases. Do the real interest rate and the nominal interest rate move together? As long as expected inflation is held constant. We get rid of this big X. These guys look like they move together. If this one is held constant, if this one goes down, that one goes down with it. So they move together. So it's 1, 2, and 3. So, can't be 4, I guess. 1, 2, and 3. Oh, this does remind me, this idea of bond prices does remind me of a fact that may help you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. You'll be fine. But a fact that I don't emphasize, to have a true, in-depth understanding of the supply and demand for money, you really need to know. But we don't need that in-depth understanding for this class. You really are supposed to know that interest rates and the price of bonds have an inverse relationship. When one goes up, the other goes down. Just memorize that before you walk into the test. It might help you. Okay? When one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. That might help you. It might help you, like, suppose you're working a monetary policy problem and you're getting questioned right, you're getting it right, and at the very end, and you're working your way along and you figured out that the real interest rate in this one decreases. At the very end, if they ask you about bond prices, well, they have to go up because those have an inverse relationship. Can this one be the answer then, by the way? Bond prices decrease? No. Because the interest rates went down, bond prices have to go up, so it's got to be 1, 2, and 3. Okay? And then number 20, true statements about expansionary monetary policy in the long run. So normally we think about monetary policy in the short run. We just move the aggregate demand along the short run average supply curve. All right. So I'm not crazy about this question, but let's see if we can get it right without really knowing what the answer is. Let's see. If it's the long run and expansionary, I need to draw long run aggregate supply, I guess. It's vertical at full employment GDP, the amount of GDP that causes us to be fully employed. And expansionary monetary policy, I guess, would move aggregate demand to the right. Okay. Price level increases to match the increase in the money supply. I don't know. Maybe. It sounds like it's good, but I don't know. Let's try number 2. The nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate. That's always true. Oh, cool. All right, maybe that'll help. Let me eliminate anything without a 2 in it. All right. the real output level has not permanently increased. In the long run, does the real output level go up and down and up and down and permanently change? No, not unless there's growth, and this one doesn't say economic growth. In the long run, the real output level, output is GDP, is stuck. All right, so it's not permanently increased. I like that one too. It's got to be something with 2 and 3 in it. Well, the only one is E. Well, I guess the answer is E. I guess one is also true. That's not something I've ever heard, but whatever. Far be it for me to argue with the AP test review. All right, let's jump over to Unit 5. We're going to get 15 questions into this guy. How are you not taking the test? No. You're good at this. All right. Here we go. Okay, now they give you this is a bunch of pretty easy monetary fiscal policy combination questions. And then they jump into crowding out, which is not easy, but we're going to make sure we get to in review. Number 1, which of the following monetary and fiscal combinations would definitely cause a decrease in aggregate demand in the short run? So I just need to pick something that's where everything's contractionary, right? Decrease in aggregate demand. All right? What do you do to the discount rate for contractionary policy? Tighten those screws on the bank. Raise the requirements. Raise the discount rate. So increase. What do you do to government spending if you're Congress and you want to decrease aggregate demand? Cuts government spending. And what does the Fed do in the open market? Which one of these is contractionary? Selling bonds. Let me think about that. If I'm the Fed, and there's the banking system, and I sell them bonds, they give me money, the money comes out of the system to me. Yes, that's contractionary. D. All right. Let's go to the next one. Which of the following so I think this one's exactly the opposite, or almost really close to the opposite. They say we want to increase aggregate demand, so we need something expansionary. Well, expansionary would be easy money policy, make things easier on banks, allow them to make loans, so cut the required reserve ratio, cut taxes, that lets households spend more. Sometimes they save more, but spend more. Trust me.
Back and you go see your mom. All right, and then government spending. If you want expansion, the government could spend more money. So I like choice B. All right, number 3. Assuming that the economy has a low unemployment rate and a high inflation rate. Okay, so they're kind of telling me where we're at. GDP, price level. Here's aggregate supply with QF. They're kind of telling me low unemployment, high inflation. So aggregate demand must be up here, right? Kind of telling me the problem. So what's appropriate? Expansion or contraction? Contraction. Look, they want a set of policies designed to reduce the rate of inflation. Now, that's pretty inflationary to me, so yeah, let's reduce it. So let's raise the discount rate. That'll cause banks, that makes it harder on banks to get a loan. So they can't go get a loan and can't expand their reserves that way. Lower government spending is contractionary. And then selling bonds in the open market is contractionary. Okay. 4. To counter the crowding out effect. Here we are. Now we're into some real stuff. I like to say that somebody who can explain crowding out really well is destined to get a 4 on the AP test because they know a lot about economics. Somebody who can explain the net export effect really well is destined to get a 5, I think. But here's the thing. Even if you can't explain every detail of crowding out or the net export effect, you can kind of remember a little detail of it that'll kind of help you with it all. Okay? Here's what to remember. Okay, first of all, let's think about some differences between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal, set by Congress, government spending and taxation. Monetary policy, manipulating the money supply by the Fed. Which one's the one that has the most problems, the biggest list of problems? I'm not saying it's worse. Keynes thought it works better, but which one has the biggest list of problems? Fiscal or monetary? Let me. Who do you think has more problems? Congress or the economic experts who work on the Board of Governors of the Fed? Congress. Their problems with fiscal policy include set by Congress, and they're not typically PhDs in economics, so lack of expertise.
They tend to work slowly. That's probably good, but they do work slowly. It's political. Believe it or not, Congress is political. They want votes, so they tend to be more expansionary almost all the time. That's more government spending and lower taxes. That will get you votes and get you elected. Fixing inflation is not really their bag, because that means raising taxes. That will get you votes, or cutting government spending on programs, and that will get you votes. So they are not. They're political, and then fiscal policy is weakened by crowding out. And it's weakened by the net export effect. If you just remember that, you can answer questions about crowding out without knowing what it really is. That it's a weakener. It is a problem with fiscal policy. Oh, by the way, monetary policy does have its own weaknesses. But it's not political because they're not elected. It's not supposed to be political. It's run by experts. They work quickly. They are totally unaffected by crowding out. Crowding out doesn't apply to them. The net export effect actually helps monetary policy. So that can actually help you answer questions about the net export effect. All right, but back to the crowding out effect. Oh, by the way, what are the weaknesses of monetary policy then? It's this idea that contractionary monetary policy works really well. When you cut off the flow of money to banks, they can't loan it out. If you tell banks, nope, you got to keep excess or higher required reserves, they can't loan it out anyway. So fixing inflation through monetary policy tends to work very well. But the other side, fixing unemployment through monetary policy, getting banks to expanding the money supply and hoping aggregate demand moves to the right requires banks to loan that extra money supply. What if banks are nervous and they don't loan? And then it requires businesses to respond to the lower interest rates by investing in capital. And what if businesses are nervous and they don't? So it turns out that monetary policy is probably better at contraction than it is at expansion. We call that cyclical asymmetry. It's better at fixing contractions or better at fixing inflation in the business cycle than it is at fixing recession in the business cycle. There's asymmetry. It's not symmetrical. All right, so let's go a little bit. Let's describe the crowding out problem faced by Congress and fiscal policy. All right, typically we describe crowding out, and then the opposite is reverse crowding out. So, suppose the goal was expansionary fiscal. What's that mean? What do they want? They want more aggregate demand, right? Without knowing what it is, but knowing it's a weakener, what is crowding out going to do? If their goal is more aggregate demand, what is crowding out going to do? What's the last step going to be? Less aggregate demand. Without knowing anything, you can figure that out. Just knowing it's a weakener. Is it going to cancel out all the effects of the expansion? Probably not. Depends on the economist. But it is going to weaken it. Okay, what actually happens? Well, expansionary fiscal policy is more government spending and or less taxation. Well, one of the two, doesn't matter. And this leads us to a situation where there's more money going out, less money coming in. I don't know where we started. Did we start at a balanced budget? Did we start with a surplus? Did we start with a deficit? I don't know. But no matter where we start, we're going to head towards a deficit, right? So I like to say this moves us towards a deficit. And the government, in order to finance its deficit, in order to spend more money than they take in taxes, must borrow. So the government borrows. So now I've got to draw the market for borrowing. What is that? It's also the market for loaning. Well, it's a market. It's got quantity, it's got demand, it's got supply. You're right. It's the loanable funds market. What's the price of a loan? Interest rate. Real or nominal? Well, nominal goes on the money market. M and N go next to each other in the alphabet. So this must be the one that has real on it. Okay? Who demands loanable funds? People who are borrowing. Like the government here. And just as a little side note, who supplies loanable funds? Why is there money available to borrow? Where do they get their money? Where do banks get their money? People who took their money to the bank and said, I want to save some money for a while. The supply of loanable fund ultimately comes from savers. Put their money in the bank to make it available for loans. All right, but here the government is borrowing money. Oops. According to my little graph here, that drives up the interest rate. Let me create some room. What does a higher interest rate do? My tattoo says less investment, and that's less aggregate demand. Is that what we expected? A weakening of the goal of expansion? Yeah! This is called government is crowding out private investment. they're borrowing the money, so businesses can't afford to borrow it and invest. What does this do to growth, by the way? Suppose they asked you this, and then the next question says, hey, how could this affect growth? Well, we're buying less of a resource. This is a resource called capital that we're buying. We're buying less capital, so growth would be less. But you got to explain. You can't say less growth. What's your explanation for less growth? Less capital. Okay. Anyway, there's crowding out. Reverse crowding out would be change all the arrows and make them go the other way. All right. Now, this particular review likes to ask you questions about crowding out as if to say, what if the Fed wanted to help with this? What if the Fed knew this crowding out was going to happen? Congress was trying expansionary policy, but the Fed knew that some of it was going to be crowded out. How could the Fed offset this? Well, they could use expansion of their own, right? So the answer to this one is the Fed could use expansion of their own. Let's go over here and see what the Federal Reserve can. They don't control taxes. That's contractionary. That's contractionary. Buy bonds. That's expansionary. So they could use expansion of their own to help with the idea that expansionary fiscal policy gets weakened by crowding out. Which of the following would best portray long-run economic growth? Well, that's kind of a shift in gears. But it's two ways to draw economic growth. Unless they tell you, hey, economic growth, don't do this. But if they do, you can draw it two ways. GDP, price level. Economic growth is a long-run phenomenon. It does not refer to aggregate demand moving around or short-run aggregate supply. It is a long-run phenomenon, so it refers to long-run aggregate supply, which is vertical at full employment GDP, moving to the right. Normally, we don't move full employment GDP. It's some fixed amount, and then equilibrium moves below it or above it. But here, I have a fear that tomorrow you're going to move around full employment GDP a bunch. Don't do it. Leave it where it is. And equilibrium GDP might move below it or above it. Below it in a recession, above it in inflation. But either way, here, because this is a unique long-run phenomenon of long-run growth, full employment actually does move. So there's one way to draw it. Anybody know the other way to draw it? There's PPC moving out. They're both caused by the same thing. More or better resources. More or better land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Okay. So the answer to that one is right would shift to the long-run aggregate supply curve. An increase in which of the following would be most likely to increase long-run growth? So what did I just say causes growth? More or better resources. Let's see if I can find one. Taxes? Nope. Interest rate? Maybe. Let me check my tattoo here. An increase in interest rates. That leads to less investment. Oh, no, I thought that might be growth, but less investment is actually less capital. I need more capital. So maybe a decrease in interest rates would do it. Cutting interest rates would mean more investment, more capital. That's more of a resource. More land, labor, capital. So that's not going to do it. Consumer spending is a determinant of aggregate demand. That's a short-run phenomenon. Ooh, productivity, that's better resources, right? More productive laborers, more productive capital, more productive land. That's better. More or better resources. I like productivity. And then I don't like E. So I like D there. All right, 9 more questions. Here we go. An expansionary fiscal policy will result in an increase in the interest rate unless which of the following actions occurs. What's that first line mean? Expansionary fiscal policy causing the interest rate to grow up. To go up. That's crowding out. It's that. It's crowding out. But either way, if that happens, what could offset it? What could keep that from happening? I don't think just changing the version of fiscal policy is going to help. What if the money supply is increased? Will that keep the interest rate from going up? Let me draw the money supply and see. I don't know. Would that keep the interest rate from growing up? From going up? I guess so. The interest rate would go up, but this would bring it back down. I don't like these other answers. Selling government bonds would cause the supply of money move to the left, and that would cause interest rates to go up even more. An expansionary monetary policy may promote long-run growth if it leads to... Oh, man. Well, look right here. Here's expansionary monetary policy. Right? How could that promote long-run growth? Let me see what happens next. Lower interest rate,
More investment. Oh, wait a minute. That is more, in the short run, what happens? More aggregate demand, right? More building more buying of machines. When you buy them, you have them. Could that be more growth? Let's suppose for a second this is a free response question. They say, hey, well, how would this affect growth? You got to explain how. You can't just say, yes, more growth. How does this affect growth? What words need to be on your paper for the grader to go, yes, there's the answer? How does that mean more growth? What?
You make more things than an increase in capital.
He just said an increase in capital. This is more capital. When the grader sees the words more investment means more capital, they think that's why there's more growth. Boom. Check. Investment is weird. It is both demand, because you're buying something, but you're buying a resource so it can lead to growth. By the way, if they don't ask you about growth, don't answer. Just assume they're talking short run if they don't ask you about growth. If they're asking you about, so hey, what does investment do? Tell me about aggregate demand. Unless they say, hey, what about in the long run? What about with growth? If they don't say, assume short run. The government increases spending without a tax increase, and simultaneously no monetary policy or changes are likely. Okay? Let's see. So this is expansionary monetary policy. And they didn't raise taxes to raise extra money to pay for it, so that sounds like a deficit. And they're going to start asking me questions about, is the effect on income? Let's pretend it doesn't say income. Let's pretend it says GDP. GDP and income are roughly equal, depending on some assumptions that we commonly make, but let's pretend it says GDP. So they're going to ask me a bunch of questions about the effect on GDP. Well, which one's the right answer? Well, the GDP would not rise at all. I think that's unlikely. This is expansionary. More government spending is expansionary. The rise in GDP may be more than the multiplier would predict because of some change in interest rates. No, in fact, when I read some change in interest rates, I'm thinking they're referring to crowding out. Fiscal policy action that changes interest rates, that sounds like crowding out. Crowding out doesn't improve the effect of fiscal policy, it weakens it. Let me see if I can find that. The rise in GDP may be smaller, weaker, than the multiplier would predict because the higher interest rates will crowd out private investment. I like to see. Number 10, a Congress and the Federal Reserve both wish to encourage the growth of productive capacity. Productive capacity is your capacity to produce. It's how much capital you have. So if they both wanted more capital, they both wanted more investment, what does my tattoo say they should try to achieve with the interest rate? Lower interest rates. So how could, let's see. Okay, first of all, how could the Fed achieve lower interest rates? Expansionary monetary policy, right? Move the supply of money to the right. Draw the supply of money, move to the right. I promise you it'll lower the interest rate. So let's find something with expansionary monetary policy. Well, we want lower interest rates. I don't like A. We don't want tight money policy. We want expansionary to lower interest rates. Skip that one for now because I want to look for something to do with monetary. Because they asked me about the Fed. Reduce interest rates. Ooh, yeah. By engaging in open market operations, in other words, monetary policy, and raise taxes on personal income. Would that cause interest rates to go down? Let's look over here at my description of crowding out. Now, over here, what I have over here is, what if you lowered taxes for expansionary fiscal policy? That would eventually cause interest rates to go up and investment to go down. What if we raise taxes? The opposite would happen. The government would move towards a surplus. Towards a surplus. They would borrow less. In the loanable funds market, let me draw the blank here. In the loanable funds market, they used to borrow that amount, let's say, but they would be borrowing less. That would cause the interest rate to go down and lead to more investment. That's what we wanted in this question. What's this called, by the way? This is reverse crowding out. It's not called crowding in. Crowding in is a more complicated concept than is on the AP test. All right. So I like choice D. Both of those would lower the interest rate and raise investment. All right. 5 more questions. Okay, so they give me a bunch of junk this is just, the AP test doesn't really do this. They sort of just tell me the economic situation in the most long-winded way ever. If you kind of reach in there, you see that the CPI is going up 7% a year. What's that mean when the CPI is going up, the Consumer Price Index? It's inflation. Is that a healthy rate of inflation, 7%? Unhealthy. We want 3 to 5%. I don't like this question. Let's pretend this said 4. Because they want that to be healthy. If this said 4, they said 6, just it's bad. Let's say it said 4. Is that healthy? Yeah. Unemployment? Oh yeah. So the problem with this economy is inflation. So which of the following actions is appropriate when we have inflation? Well, contraction. Raise the tax rate. Cut government spending. Now the Fed doesn't control the federal funds rate, but they target it. They say if that interest rate goes up and down, all interest rates will be going up and down. What do they want to happen to interest rates if they want contraction? They want them to go up or down? Let's try up. My tattoo says less investment. That is contractionary. So they would want to target the federal funds rate and make it go up. So I like choice B. It's a really long-winded question. When the unemployment rate is 10%, this one's exactly the opposite, I believe. When the unemployment rate is 10%, in other words, too high, and the CPI is only rising at 2%, so inflation is just fine. Healthy inflation is 3 to 5%. So this looks like an economy that needs expansion, doesn't it? Unemployment's high, inflation's nice and steady. Looks like an economy that's down here, right? Below full employment. Should I label this full employment? Don't move full employment around, it's stuck somewhere. Anyway, do you label my axes? Alright, the Fed buys bonds in the open market. What will happen? Is this appropriate for the Fed to buy bonds in the open market during this recession? Yeah, that's expansionary. And we've drawn it 1,000,000 times. That increases the supply of money, decreases the interest rate, which increases investment, which increases both real GDP and the price level. That's good. We don't like that, but we'll deal with it. I like B. Well, the unemployment rate is 4.5%, and the CPI, this is more the same stuff. That's healthy unemployment. That is unhealthy inflation. So here we want contraction. So the Fed sells bonds in the open market. That is contractionary. Good job, Fed. What happens? The opposite stuff happens. Contractionary policy raises interest rates, decreases investment, decreases real GDP and the price level. We like the price level to be in control. That's good. I guess we're going to have to deal with lower GDP to fight the inflation. There's always that trade-off in the short run. Moving aggregate demand with policy always causes one happy face and one sad face. Yay, lower unemployment. But oh no, higher inflation. Yay, lower inflation. Oh no, higher unemployment. Do you guys remember, this leads us into the next question, the graph that illustrates that trade-off? This idea that when you get unemployment to go down, inflation tends to go up. And when you get inflation to go down, that's good, but unemployment tends to go up. Do y'all remember? Because you could graph that as a downward sloping line, right? This inverse relationship between controlling unemployment and controlling inflation. Don't remember what that's called? I'll draw it real quick. There. Don't remember what that's called? It's a Phillips curve. And it is the short run Phillips curve because it shows what happens as aggregate slides around in the short run. It's inflation and unemployment. Where do they go? Inflation. I don't remember. Here's how I remember though. Here's how I remind myself. I remember how to draw price level, GDP, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, right? Well, so the axes match up. What problem matches with price level? Oh, inflation, which by the way is a percent. What problem matches with GDP? Not enough GDP is going to cause unemployment. Oh, there we go. Beautiful. And it's a good idea, by the way, so the answer here is the Phillips curve. It's a good idea, by the way, to slide aggregate demand around and see what happens. If you slid aggregate demand to the right, you get higher inflation but lower unemployment. You'd move along that way. If you slid aggregate demand to the left, you'd move along this way. You get lower inflation but higher unemployment.
What causes this thing to shift? It's a good idea to practice shifting the aggregate supply curve around. Aggregate supply moves to the right. Both problems get better. Lower inflation and lower unemployment because of more GDP. So that which way shows both problems getting smaller and better? That way, that would be aggregate supply moving to the left. Phillips curve prime. And then if aggregate supply got shocked, by the way, always have a good supply shock in your brain. I like to use natural disaster because they like to ask you, hey, what would cause aggregate supply to suddenly move to the left? All right, use natural disaster or oil crisis. If that happened, both things get worse. Prices go up and GDP gets lower, so unemployment goes up, and that moves us out. This is a graph of badness, and so we get more badness. Okay? There's a short run Phillips curve. What does a long run Phillips curve look like? Let me, I have a serious problem here. The long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, so is the long run Phillips curve. Long run Phillips curve. Students all the time draw it and they label it long run aggregate supply. I don't know why. Just like drawing a cat. And they go, hey, great cat, good job, and then label it dog. If it asks you for the long run Phillips curve, right? Long run Phillips curve. But it's vertical, not QF. QF is an amount of unemployment. QF is an amount of GDP. It's full employment GDP. This is not a GDP axis. QF belongs over here on a GDP axis. When you're doing aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is not an amount of GDP. This is an amount of unemployment. This is the full employment level of unemployment, 3 to 5%. In the long run, we're always there, according to economic theory. What is the, what do we call this? The NRU. So only put the NRU on an unemployment axis, because it's an amount of unemployment. Only put full employment GDP on a GDP axis. These go together, they sort of correspond and match up, but they're not exactly the same. All right? If they don't ask for the long run Phillips curve, don't draw it. If they don't ask for the long run aggregate supply curve, don't draw it. If they don't ask, do short run. And then final question of the day. In the short run, combining an expansionary fiscal policy with a tight money policy, well, this one's going to cause more GDP, this one's going to cause less GDP. So I don't know what's going to happen to GDP. But wait a minute. Expansionary fiscal policy, if you look back over at our crowding out description, higher interest rate, right? Expansionary fiscal policy, higher interest rate. Tight money policy, well, supply of money, interest rate, supply of money, move the supply of money to the left. Higher interest rate, they both cause a higher interest rate. So that's good enough for today. Study crowding out. It's good. The AB test loves it.